This documentary explores the events of serial killers from ages 1 to 100 for educational purposes only. The content is disturbing and not meant to be emulated or glorified. Viewer discretion is advised. This documentary adheres to YouTube's monetization guidelines and aims to present the information responsibly. Enjoy.
Ages 1 to 100 serial killers. So first thing I'd like to say is that I got this idea from none other than Mr. Beast. I wanted to put a morbid twist on his concept of the same name. Second, yes, we will be talking about serial killers from as young as toddlers to as old as senior citizens. Now, though we tried looking for serial killers, which by definition is a person who commits a series of murders, often with no apparent motive, and typically following a characteristic, predictable behavior pattern. Not everyone on this list is exactly a serial killer. It's a mix of murderers and serial killers. However, we did try collecting information on people that killed multiple times and didn't just so happen to kill once. As we get to the older ages, you'll realize that a lot of the reasons for the killings are just sad. And also, as we get to the older folk, there are some on this list who didn't get caught until their 80s, for example. So yeah, there are some old people on this list that weren't exactly killing at 87, for example, it just so happened to be caught. Why? Because this took so much research, and I guess not everything is documented on the internet. So we did try our best though and made sure to live up to the actual title of the video. And like the intro said, this video isn't made to glorify any of these actions. This is simply for educational purposes only. And if you aren't subscribed, don't even worry about it. I promise I'll earn your subscription by the end of this video. And the last thing I want to do is thank today's sponsor, Factor. Today's video is sponsored by Factor. What is Factor, you may be asking? Well, this is a company that specializes in pre-made meals. What's that? You say you're picky? Every fresh, never frozen meal is chef crafted, dietitian approved, and ready to eat in just 2 minutes. Choose from a weekly menu of 35 options, including popular options like Calorie Smart, Keto, Protein Plus, or Vegan and Veggie. Also discover more than 60 add-ons every week, like breakfast, on-the-go lunch, snacks, beverages, to help you stay fueled and feel good all day long. Listen, I know some of you guys have a busy lifestyle that doesn't exactly let you go to the grocery store every time your fridge is empty. Or maybe you could just use a better diet after picking up a new routine, or are trying to cut food delivery services like me. With that being said, head to factor75.com or click the link below and use code TUV50 for 50% off your first Factor box and 20% off your next month of orders. That's code TUV50 at factor75.com to get 50% off your first box and 20% off your next month of orders. And now let's start our video. 3-year-old. So why are we skipping ages 1 to 2? Well, the answer is we just couldn't find any. Literally, couldn't find a 1-year-old or a 2-year-old that was so happened to be a murderer. But surprisingly, we did find every other age except for one of them, which you'll see later in the old people section. But so let's actually get started with the video and let's talk about the 3-year-old. There's a case from Benwood, West Virginia, where in 1897, a 3-year-old girl named Miss Zia Pasa hacked and stabbed a 2-month-old infant with a butcher knife. The 3-year-old had been left alone with the infant, who belonged to a neighbor, Edward Shapak, and she simply just stabbed her, cut off the nose, and almost severed the arm. There's also another 3-year-old from Gull, Norway, who killed his sister in 1893. According to the source, the boy used a Norwegian knife to cut a hole so deep in his sister's belly that the insides came out. Help apparently had come after 3 or 4 hours after the incident, but unfortunately the damage was so bad that the child died about a day later. 4-year-old. There's a novel that was published in 1886 about a man, Dr. Jekyll, with a pretty bizarre alter ego who committed crimes, Mr. Hyde. I'm bringing that up because in this next case, that of Retta McCabe, had a newspaper draw parallels with the novel. McCabe, who murdered her infant brother, was said to alternate between being, quote, a pretty, smiling child with laughing eyes and dancing dimples, and a, quote, uncontrollable demon. It was in that uncontrollable state that she'd apparently hurled her brother to the floor and beat him up so badly that just a week later, he died from the injuries. Oh, and McCabe was also described as both suicidal and homicidal, with evidence of that, including a time when she sat on train tracks at Union stations in front of approaching trains. 5-year-old. And I also forgot to say in the intro that since this is 100 cases, there's not going to be a lot of info about each. Like, we really got to get through these. I don't know how long this video is going to be, so I just want to make that clear. Don't expect a full story time for each of these ages. Anyway, let's continue with the 5-year-old story. There are 2 alleged cases of 5-year-olds having committed murders. One involves an unnamed boy from Rifilk, Norway, where they killed one person in 1924. I couldn't get the details though, as the publication that story is from is basically non-existent. Second is an unnamed girl from Naples, Italy, who killed one person in 1898, and just like the first story, the original publication of this story is not in English and is from 1898, so it's pretty difficult to get a hold of. 6-year-old. At 6 years old, we have a boy named Carl Newton Mahan whose killing of his friend, 8-year-old Cecile Van Hoos, left many wondering how he'd even managed to hold and point a rifle in the first place. So the story is that in May of 1929, these 2 friends were doing what rural boys in Kentucky would do on a normal day: forage items they could turn into pennies at local junkyards. Apparently, as they looked around, Carl came across a decent piece of scrap iron that definitely had some worth, but Cecile, who was bigger and stronger, took it away from him. Fuming with anger, Carl ran home, climbed up on a chair, grabbed his dad's shotgun, came back outside, pointed it at Cecile, and pulled the trigger. A total of 19 pellets hit Cecile, who died barely 10 minutes later. Weirdly, Carl's never really got convicted, as jury politics saw his case grow cold and fade. He died of suicide at 35 though. 7-year-old. In 2022, just a week before his birthday, 32-year-old Brandon O'Quinn Raspberry was found dead at an RV park in Nixon, Texas. Police had been unable to establish any clues as to what might have happened to him, and so the case sort of went cold. That was, however, until this year in April, a 10-year-old who remains unnamed apparently confessed to the killing. All this came out when, during a bus ride, the boy threatened to kill another student, and as the school officials questioned him about it, he confessed that he had actually killed before. He had shot and killed a man 2 years prior. When authorities were involved, he went on to give details about Raspberry's death that only the perpetrator would know. It turned out that just age 7, while visiting his grandfather, who also lived at the RV park, he took his pistol and wandered around with it. He then saw Raspberry sleeping and he fired a single shot, striking him in the head. 8-year-old. Next up is Amarjit Sada, who when just 8 years old was responsible for 3 murders, though 2 of them remained unreported to authorities. His first victim was his 6-year-old cousin, who in 2006 he tortured to death in their village Musahar, that being in the state of Bihar, India, and although he confessed to it, his parents protected him. He would then go on to kill his younger sister, strangling her to death, with his parents strangely choosing not to report him to the police. Bad decision on their end, because soon after he used the same MO to murder a 6-month-old baby named Kushbu. He apparently found her sleeping somewhere in their school, took her away, strangled her, and hit her with a brick before burying her. I mean, this kid was so vile that a psychologist described him as a sadist who derived pleasure from inflicting injuries. Now, interestingly, once he turned 18 in 2016, he changed his identity and no one knows his current whereabouts. 9-year-old. Back in the 1900s, a kid named Cayetano Santos Godino, aka El Petiso Orejudo, which translates to that on the screen, became known as the world's youngest serial killer at the time after a spree of terror activities that lasted between ages 9 and 16. Although his confession was obtained when he was about 16 years old, his first victim had been when he was around 9 years old, and in that span, he'd killed 4 kids, the ones confirmed. These included a 2-year-old girl, a 13-year-old named Arturo Laurana, a 5-year-old named Rainer Vanikov, and a 3-year-old named Jesualdo Giordano. Also, besides the murders, he'd really been a menace, for example, having set fire to a warehouse on Corrientes Street and telling the police, "I like to see firemen working. It's nice to see how they fall into the fire." Actually, fire was kind of a thing for him because that 5-year-old I just mentioned, Reina, died after Godino set fire to her dress. He also set fire to a railway station and someone's shed. And he also tried to strangle an 8-year-old Robert Russo, kidnap a 2-year-old, and a lot more. A clearly deranged character. 10-year-old. At 10 years old, we have a kid named Mary Bell, who in 1968, aged just 10, had her first murder victim, a 4-year-old named Martine Brown. She had strangled him and then went on to leave haunting confession notes for his family. Then, just 2 months later, she had a second victim, a 3-year-old by the name Brian Ho. She had strangled him as well and mutilated his body using a pair of scissors, including scratching his thighs and butchering his private area. Now, for the 2 murders, Bell was sentenced to life in prison at just age 11. However, she got released after 12 years, aged 23, and went on to live her life. And just like the case of Godino, the 9-year-old serial killer, Bell also had other strange behaviors that had seen her try to strangle other kids as well. 11-year-old. In 1998, 11-year-old Andrew Golden and an accomplice named Mitchell Johnson, age 13, crafted a rather chilling plan that saw them open fire with multiple weapons at Westside Middle School, leading to multiple deaths. Golden had apparently excused himself to use the bathroom, then pulled a fire alarm, and as other students and teachers ran outside, he and Johnson hid at a nearby construction site and opened fire. In the process, they killed 5 people and wounded 10 others before trying to flee the scene. This was such a horrific incident that to date, it remains the deadliest mass shooting at a middle school in the US. The two were imprisoned until they turned 21, then released. Golden, who had changed his name to Drew Grant, passed away in 2019 in a car crash, a head-on collision on a highway in Arkansas. 12-year-old. In 1966, in a pretty horrific incident, 12-year-old Piedad Martinez del Aguila killed her 4 siblings because, as the eldest daughter, she was overburdened by the responsibility of caring for them. She was apparently required to feed, change, and dress the younger ones, while also having to clean, do laundry, and prepare meals. So she just decided that she had enough, and using a combination of DDT and potassium cyanide, she offed them in ascending order just 5 days apart. She'd slipped the poison mixture into their milk during meal times, and it only took about 30 minutes for each victim to die. They'd however experienced very severe symptoms before death, including blackouts, strong convulsions, purple spots, rashes, etc. While initially the parents were suspected, under some pressure, Piedad confessed to the killings, although she insisted that the first 3 were under the instruction of her mother and that the 4th one was just an impulse. 13-year-old. In the late 1980s, a 13-year-old boy by the name of Craig Chandler Price had become such a horrific killer in Rhode Island that he became known as the Slasher of Warwick. Hailing from the Buttonwoods neighborhood of Warwick, Price had committed his first murder while aged just 13. He killed a neighbor, 27-year-old Rebecca Spencer, by stabbing her at least 58 times. He would then go on to murder yet another neighbor, Joanne Heaton. He used kitchen knives to stab her a total of 63 times alongside 2 of her daughters. He was also so nonchalant about the whole thing, he even mimicked the sounds of the girls dying to investigators. Now, he got 29 years in jail and was to be released in 2020, but that was before he got another 25 years for trying to stab a fellow inmate at the Sewanee Correctional Institution. 14-year-old. Next on this list is Jesse Pomeroy, a boy who was so vile that when it came to his conviction in September of 1876, he was sentenced to life imprisonment to be served under solitary confinement. What did he do? Well, a lot. He had 2 confirmed victims, Horace Millen and Katie Curran, and was suspected to have been responsible for possibly more than 9 other deaths. He was known to terrorize the South Boston area, where he, for instance, had tortured a young boy in 1872, beating him up, assaulting him, and leaving him tied to a telephone post. He was also known to lure young boys in Charlestown with money and treats, then take them to a remote location and have his way with them. He in fact got the nicknames the Boy Torturer and the Red Devil from doing exactly that. 15-year-old. In 2023, in a village in Kenya, East Africa, a 16-year-old girl, only identified by the courts as BW, was convicted to 10 years in jail for the murder of 3 of her siblings and a cousin. When she was 14, going by her confession, she apparently had killed the siblings, aged 15 months, 5 years, and 7.5 years, all in the months between February and July of 2021. A year later, in 2022, aged 15, she'd also killed her 20-month-old cousin, who she suffocated to death before throwing into a borehole. Oh, and it was actually his father who turned her in after he made a report in a nearby police station stating that he suspected that she was the murderer of his children. The courts, however, focused on the murder of the 20-month-old because it was the only one that they could prove beyond doubt. 16-year-old. Sometime in 2017, a state correctional institution at Camp Hill, a 25-year-old prisoner by the name of Alec Kreider was found hanging in his cell by prison staff, and although they tried to revive him, he was pronounced dead upon arrival at the hospital. Now, though the suicide was shocking, it wasn't the worst thing that Kreider had done, because a few years back, age 16, he had snuck into a classmate's home and stabbed him and his parents. This was actually the reason Kreider was in prison in the first place. He'd used a hunting knife on the 3 victims, and according to police reports, he just walked into the home at 2 a.m. via an unlocked door. He started in the parents' bedroom, then his classmates, but before he got to the 3rd bedroom, the occupant, Bucknell, the couple's daughter, escaped. In his journals, which were read in court, Kreider apparently expressed a want/need to kill people and having murderous thoughts. 17-year-old. In a truly bizarre incident in 2012, a 17-year-old by the name Thomas Michael Lane III, aka TJ, opened fire at the Chardon High School cafeteria, leading to 3 deaths: Russell King Jr., Demetrius Hulin, and Danny Parmentor, and 3 injuries. TJ, who is thought to have partly wanted to settle a personal score with one of the victims, had opened fire from a .22 caliber handgun before being tackled by a teacher, Joseph Ritzy, and a coach, Frank Hall. He was subsequently arrested by the police, and part of what shocked most was his sheer disregard for the victims and lack of remorse. In the courtroom, for instance, he not only wore a white shirt with the word killer written on it, but also addressed the surviving victims with profanity. Anyway, he got handed 3 consecutive life sentences for his actions. Also, and maybe unsurprisingly, he escaped from the Allen Correctional Institution in Lima, Ohio in 2014, but was recaptured in less than 24 hours. He is currently at a Supermax prison facility, the Warren Correctional Institution in Ohio. 18-year-old. In 1971, a 19-year-old boy by the name of Gary Gene Grant was charged with 4 murders. He'd killed 2 teenagers and 2 children. Interestingly though, before police had narrowed in on him, another man, John Chance, had actually confessed to the murders and was believed to have done it. This was before it was quickly determined that he was mentally ill and innocent. Subsequent evidence placed Grant at the center of all 4 murders. His first was when he was aged just 18. He stabbed and raped 19-year-old Carol Erickson, who'd been a student at a nearby college in Renton. That was in December 1969, and he would then kill again in 1970, the victim being Joanne Zuloff, and then in 1971, with the victims being 2 6-year-olds, Bradley Lyons and Scott Andrews. He was found guilty on 4 counts, although an illegal police recording of his interrogation almost derailed the entire case. He still got life imprisonment though, and is currently in jail, aged 73. 19-year-old. One of the most insane serial killer stories is that of 19-year-old Charles Starkweather and his 14-year-old girlfriend Carol Ann Fugate. These two killed 11 people in the span of 7 days back in 1958. The first incident was when they got into a heated argument with the girlfriend's stepfather and mother, Velda and Marion Bartlett. They ended up shooting both of them. They then fatally strangled the girlfriend's little sister, Betty Jean, aged just 2.5. A few days after being holed up in the scene, they took off in the Starkweathers' car, and on their way, they murdered a farmer, August Mayer, and his dog, then also murdered 2 teenagers, Robert Jensen and Carol King, who had offered the 2 a ride after their car ran into a ditch. That was on January 27, 1958. One day later, on the 28th, they killed a Lincoln businessman, Chester Larward. They also killed his wife and their maid. Then, yet another day later, they killed a shoe salesman, Merle Collison, and they also stole his car. They were captured on January 30th. Following a murder conviction, Starkweather was given an electric chair while Fugate got life imprisonment. 20-year-old. This next one also isn't a serial killer, but is just horribly ruthless. And it actually happened this month. I'm filming this in July, and this happened on Sunday of July 21st. So according to police reports, a 20-year-old man used a knife to stab and kill his mother at around 12:30 in the morning in the area of Banning Boulevard, LA. The mom, aged 42, suffered 4 stab wounds. The dad, aged 50, also suffered serious injuries, though he was taken to a hospital and pronounced to be in stable condition. Truly tragic. 21-year-old. Between April and October of 2022, 21-year-old Sifiso Mkwanzi, based on his own admission to his dad, killed a total of 6 sex workers in the Johannesburg area of South Africa. Now, as it stands to contention, and what prosecutors went back and forth about with the defense, is whether all the murders were premeditated or not. Prosecutors argue that all victims whose bodies were found stashed in various parts of his father's workshop had very similar signs pointing to some premeditation. The argument was that he would lure them, bind them, and gag their mouths before raping and killing them. His defense? Well, he said he'd only killed them after they raised their prices over what was agreed on because he was afraid they'd report him and he'd get arrested. The judge differed though, wondering how that same mistake could happen 6 times over. 22-year-old. In 2014, aged 22, Elliot Rodger went on one of the most bizarre murderous sprees ever witnessed in Isla Vista, California. First, he killed his 2 roommates and their friend in their apartment. He ambushed and stabbed them, one at a time as they came in. A few hours later, he uploaded a YouTube video, a sort of manifesto detailing his intention to kill women for not noticing him and men that these women were attracted to. He then emailed out a 137-page manifesto saying the same things and more. He would then go on to shoot and kill 2 women at the UCSB sorority house, and then a man at a nearby delicatessen. As he moved around, he also rammed into pedestrians with his BMW and shot indiscriminately. In the process, he injured about 14 people before finally crashing into a parked car. Then, right before the police got to him, keep in mind they already shot him once in the hip, he committed suicide with 1 bullet to the head. 23-year-old Yusuf Palani, who in April 2022 killed 2 men, Michael Snee and Aiden Moffat, in a rather horrific manner. It came out in court that he'd stabbed the one victim at least 43 times and decapitated them. Then, he'd stabbed the second victim 25 times in the head, neck, and chest. And he did also stab a third victim, Anthony Burke, in the eye, although they didn't die. Why? Well, according to the police, Palani had a prejudice against homosexuality. In fact, he got his victims from social media and gay dating apps. I'm not gonna lie, dude, it is pretty gay to download a gay dating app just to kill said gay people. He still downloaded the gay dating app. Interestingly, he denied having been to the surviving victim's house, despite his semen being found on Burke's blanket and phone records showing the two linked up. 24-year-old. At 11:48 a.m. on August 1st, 1966, a 24-year-old by the name of Charles J. Whitman climbed on a building at the University of Texas at Austin, having pretended to be a maintenance worker. With him, he had an assortment of rifles, pistols, and shotguns, and in a span of about 96 minutes, he had killed a total of 15 people and wounded 31 others. Now, that wasn't all he had done that day. Earlier on, a little past midnight, he drove to his mother's house and killed her. Police believed he'd gotten her unconscious before stabbing her in the heart with a knife. Then he had gone back to his place, 906 Jewel Street, where he found his wife Kathy asleep and proceeded to stab her 5 times in the chest, killing her instantly. Worth noting also is that he had premeditated all of it, as he even wrote notes in between the murders. 25-year-old. In the early 80s, a white man, Joseph G. Christopher, who was also a former Army private, went on a killing spree that terrorized Western New York and earned him the nickname the .22 caliber killer. That's the gun he'd used in the murder spree of September 22nd, 1980, where he killed 3 black men and 1 boy in the span of 36 hours. He shot the boy, Glenn Dunn, age 14, at a supermarket, then Harold Green, 32, as he dined at a restaurant, and then Emmanuel Thomas, age 30, as he crossed the street. 2 days later, he also killed Joseph McCoy. Then, the following month in October, he murdered 2 taxi drivers, Parler Edwards and Ernest Jones, both times bludgeoning them to death before cutting their hearts out. For all of that and more, 19 victims total, Christopher got life imprisonment but died in 1993, aged 35, from cancer. 26-year-old. Earlier this year, in the month of March, the Langhorne PD got quite busy chasing down Andre Gordon, a 26-year-old man who had murdered several members of his family in just the span of a few hours. Starting out on Saturday at about 8 in the morning, he hijacked a car in Trenton, New Jersey, drove to Viewpoint Lane in Levittown, Pennsylvania, where he forced his way into a house and, armed with an AR-15 style weapon, killed his stepmother and 13-year-old sister. He then went to a home just 2 miles away where he killed the mother of his 2 kids, 25-year-old Taylor Daniel. He also bludgeoned Daniel's mom. Fleeing the scene, he hijacked another car and went to lie low in Trenton. Police tried to swat him, but he escaped only to be caught later that day at around 5 p.m., unarmed and just walking the streets. 27-year-old. Just this year, a mother from New Jersey, 27-year-old Naomi Elkins, killed her 2 kids, aged 1 and 3, in an honestly mind-bendingly weird incident for what she believed were, quote, religious purposes. She had grabbed the younger one and submerged her in bathroom water for a couple of minutes until she died. The older child had run off to a different bathroom, screaming out of fear, but then she got to her as well and did the same thing. She told investigators that she held each child down long enough, even counting to 50, to make sure they were dead. Realizing she'd done something wrong, she then called a nearby medical facility, Hatsala Medical Service, but unfortunately, the medics couldn't help much even with CPR attempts. The younger child also apparently had a stab wound on her stomach. What's even more unsettling about this one is that Elkins worked at a daycare facility. 28-year-old. Last year, a 28-year-old by the name Audrey Elizabeth Hale was shot and killed by the police in Nashville, Tennessee after a confrontation following an attack at a private school by the name Convent School. According to reports, Hale, who identified as transgender, armed with 2 assault-type rifles and a handgun, had entered the school through one of the doors and proceeded to shoot and kill 6 people. These included 3 9-year-olds, 2 61-year-olds, and a 60-year-old. The chief of police on the case, John Drake, told reporters that Hale had a manifesto and map drawn out. Also, about 20 minutes before making her move, she had messaged a friend telling her that all she was about to do would make sense someday. Her motive, though, remains unknown, and her actions are sort of associated with a mental disorder that she was getting treated for. 29-year-old. On August 12, 2021, Plymouth police got a distress call from an address in the Biddick Drive neighborhood. It took them 6 minutes to get there, but unfortunately all it had taken for Jake Davison to kill 2 women, 2 men, and a 3-year-old girl was 6 minutes. Davison had first shot and killed his mother, 51-year-old Maxine Chapman, then Chris Escott, his cousin. He then went out on the street and killed Lee Martin, 43, and her daughter, 3-year-old Sophie Martin. He proceeded further to a nearby footpath where he killed Stephen Washington, a 59-year-old who was out walking his dogs. He shot an artist, 66-year-old Kate Shepard, who died later in the hospital. There were also 2 other victims who survived with non-life-threatening injuries. After the spree, Davidson finally turned the gun on himself and took his own life. 30-year-old. One of America's most prolific serial killers is Joseph James DeAngelo, with over 13 confirmed murders, about 51 rape cases, 60 home invasions, over 120 burglaries, and at least 106 victims. Now, general evidence points out that his first murder victims might have been in 1975 when he was age 30, but there is a chance he could have been part of shooting incidents prior to that year. Anyway, that 1975 murder, which he confessed to after his arrest in 2018, was of Claude Snelling, a 45-year-old professor who was trying to fight off DeAngelo from kidnapping his daughter. It would be the first of many that also included rape and stalking. He'd even gotten nicknames like East Area Rapist, Visalia Ransacker, Original Night Stalker, and the infamous one, Golden State Killer. He's currently age 78 and incarcerated in California, where he's serving 12 consecutive life sentences. 31-year-old. Although growing up in a stable home in St. Albans, Hertfordshire, UK, by the time he was 16, Joanna Dennehy ran off with her boyfriend, and sooner than later, she ended up with a rather chaotic life of drugs, drinking, sex work, and ultimately serial killing. In 2013, age 31, she was the sole perpetrator of what came to be known as the Peterborough Ditch Murders. She killed 3 men in a span of 10 days, with her reason being she liked how it felt. First, she lured Lucas Labaszewski, age 31, to a house owned by her landlord, blindfolded him, and stabbed him in the heart. She kept him in the dumpster. 10 days later, she lured John Chapman, 56, the same way. Remember, she was a sex worker, and stabbed him just like she did the last guy. Then, that same day, she murdered her landlord, Kevin Lee, 48, and she was given life in prison. 32-year-old. Between September and October of 2020, a 32-year-old man with that name on the screen, because I'm gonna butcher that for sure, smothered and killed 3 women in the Wolseley area of South Africa, and was found out only after a passerby discovered and reported the shallow graves where he had buried them. The first victim was Miche PNR, who was actually known to Sabambella, the murderer, and had gone to his caravan parked near Wolseley to seek help. After an argument, they fought, and he placed a blanket over her head and sat on her until she stopped moving. He buried her near the caravan. The second victim was Gisela Minar, who he also knew. He strangled her and buried her next to PNR, the first victim. Last was Bernadine Franz, who he suffocated with a duvet, sitting on her until she stopped moving. A pretty bizarre MO. Anyway, he got 25 years for the 3 murders. 33-year-old. Thought to be America's first female serial killer, Eileen Wuornos was found to have murdered at least 6 men on Florida's highways in late 1989 and 1990. Having come from a very dysfunctional family where she'd experienced abuse and even incest, she never had a stable life and resorted to petty theft and sex work for survival. It wasn't until 1989 though, aged 31 years old, that she'd resort to murdering potential clients and robbing them. The first victim was Richard Mallory, age 51, who was found dumped in the woods, riddled with bullets. She had claimed that he had tried to rape her. It would however soon be discovered that there were 5 other bodies in the area, all leading back to her. Among these was a salesman, a retired U.S. Air Force major, and a trucker. There was also thought of a 7th victim, Peter Abraham, though his body was never found. She got 6 consecutive life sentences and died in 2002 in prison, aged 46. 34-year-old. In 2023, a 34-year-old man by the name of Dennis Kazungu made headlines for smiling as he got convicted of killing a total of 14 people in the suburbs of Rwanda. The police had gone to his home to look for evidence on a robbery and rape case that he was facing, only for them to stumble on a pit that he dug in his kitchen and used to stash bodies. Apparently, Kazungu had been targeting sex workers, luring them from bars, taking them home, and killing them via strangling. He did go on to confess to the murders and reveal that he learned how to kill from watching famous serial killer documentaries. His defense was that the victims, 11 who were women, had infected him with HIV, the virus that causes AIDS. 35-year-old. Barely a month ago, a long-awaited ruling was made in Canada regarding the death of 4 Indigenous women, and a lot of people celebrated the judge's decision because the suspect, Jeremy Skibicki, the 35-year-old perpetrator, had finally been brought to justice. Evidence confirms that between mid-March and mid-May of 2022, Skibicki had lured these vulnerable women to his apartment at North Kildonan, sexually assaulted them, confined them, before strangling or drowning them in his bathtub. The victims were Morgan Harris, age 39, Mercedes Myron, age 26, Rebecca Contois, age 24, and one unidentified woman. Now, what really angered most, and why the case had lots of interest, was how jarring his MO was. Apparently, he even performed sex acts on the dead bodies before dismembering them and disposing them in bins. He'd also keep some of their belongings. 36-year-old. In 2022, at the age of 36, a man by the name of Frank Cano was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder of found women Josephine Vargas, Kiana Jackson, Martha Anaya, and Jeray Nicole Estep. These murders had happened in Anaheim, California, and a surprising bit about it is that at the time of the killings, Cano was a registered sex offender, and part of the evidence against him and his co-defendant, Stephen Gordon, was the recorded movements in the GPS devices they had been wearing due to the prior sex offenses. The investigation unearthed chilling details about the two, including just how nonchalant they were about their victims, like asking each other what they felt like having on that particular night, Asian or Mexican. Also, they'd apparently lure in these sex workers, pretending to be clients, have sex with them, kill them, and dump their bodies in a dumpster near an auto shop where Gordon worked. 37-year-old. In 1977, a 19-year-old woman, Yvonne Pless, was found dead, and without any leads, her case went cold. However, years later, in 2018, Samuel Little, a man described as one of America's most prolific serial killers, confessed to that murder. This would turn out to be just one of the possibly 93 people that he killed between 1970 and 2005. The reason I have him under the 37-year-old serial killer is honestly because he could fit into any of the years, given the sheer number of his victims. In 1977 alone, for instance, he killed about 6 women. He actually gave details only the murderer would know in interrogations that lasted for close to 700 hours. This was around 2018, and although he got 3 life sentences, he died shortly after in 2020 while in prison. 38-year-old. In 2020, 38-year-old Kamratsuman Sarkar was given the death penalty by an Indian court after he was found guilty of at least 9 murder incidents, and also rape and attempted murder. His victims, aged between 16 and 75 years old, were mostly women, and their deaths were spread between 2013 and 2019. It wasn't until 2019 that he was caught and officially charged, though. That had been after the rape and murder of a 16-year-old girl in May of that year. His actions were described by the prosecution as absolutely heinous, and a maximum penalty was sought. Specifically, how he had hit the helpless minor on the head before trying to strangulate her was brought up. Surviving victims also noted that he tried strangling them with a metal chain, and that he'd often gain entry to their homes by posing as an official of the electricity department. 39-year-old. Next up is a 39-year-old Mexican man by the name of Miguel Cortez, who, although yet to be convicted, faces pretty damning evidence in a case involving the murder of several women. Described as the, quote, Mexican Jeffrey Dahmer, this pharmaceutical chemist is alleged to have murdered at least 7 women, and maybe even possibly more, with part of the proof being skull bones and other human remains found in his house. Investigators also said his curtains were bloodstained, and, even more damning, that he was caught in 17-year-old Maria Jose Castillo's room by her mother, who had been out running errands. Castillo was raped and murdered when Cortez was found in her room. He then allegedly attacked Castillo's mom, inflicting several stab wounds to the leg, back, left lung, and pelvic area. 40-year-old. Between 1983 and 1985, there were 6 reported cases of young white women with red hair and slim bodies being found murdered and their bodies disposed of near major highways or roads in the South. For 40 years, their cases remained unsolved until, by chance, high school students from the Elizabethton School in Tennessee finally cracked it. Their professor, Alex Campbell, had asked them to look into the case for the semester, and to her surprise, they linked it to Jerry Johns, aka the Bible Belt Strangler. The MO, timeline, geography, and signature of the deaths matched his, as the victims were either strangled or suffocated, and were either prostitutes or hitchhikers along these roads. Interestingly, John had already been convicted of strangling and murdering a prostitute in 1985 and had died in prison in 2015. 41-year-old. At 41, we don't have a serial killer, but rather two sinister murder cases from the UK. First is where 41-year-old Irfan Sharif, alongside his partner, Baynash Batul, and his brother, were charged in the murder of 10-year-old Sarah Sharif, whose body was found in their home in Woking, UK. A post-mortem examination had found, quote, multiple and extensive injuries over a sustained and extended period, end quote. Their case is actually ongoing. Second is the case of a 41-year-old mother, identified as Keziah Makaria, who stabbed and killed her 4-year-old son, Kobe Dooley, in the Hackney neighborhood in the UK. The incident was so gruesome that the police who responded to the scene came out crying. Kobe hadn't died instantly and had been rushed to the hospital where he succumbed to the injuries barely a day later. 42-year-old. This next one is technically a massacre, but it still fits in the video. It's a case when a father, 42-year-old Jonathan Candy, shot and killed his wife, 39-year-old Lindsay, and 3 of his children, Dylan, age 18, Ethan, 14, and Lucas, age 12. The incident, which took place in Yukon, Oklahoma, ended with Jonathan taking his own life with the same weapon. Only a 10-year-old boy was left unharmed and was the one who made the 911 call, having woken up to the massacre. So why would Jonathan do that? Well, it was suspected that he had a fight with his wife the previous night, and at some point he just took a rifle and shot her before going through the home and killing the children as well. It was also unclear why he left the youngest child unharmed. 43-year-old. Though yet to be convicted in court, 43-year-old Wesley Brownlee was identified by the police as the person behind the Stockton serial killings in California. Stanley McFadden, the police chief, said they'd been trailing him before his arrest and were convinced that he was just about to pounce on his next victim. He was wearing dark clothing, a mask, and armed with a firearm. He drove around parks, around dark places, stopping, looking around, moving again, which was consistent with patterns the police had seen before. Between April of 2021 and December of 2022, the serial killer was linked to at least 7 murders. Most of the victims had been fatally shot at close range. The police, desperate to arrest the culprit, had even released footage of the suspect on Twitter, offering a reward of $125,000 to anyone who could identify them. 44-year-old. About a month ago, 44-year-old Quincy Allen was resentenced to life in prison just 2 years after a federal court had overturned his original sentence. Now, of course, this news hit the headlines hard with different perspectives being aired, but ultimately, it came down to Allen being a serial killer. In 2002, he killed 4 people, 2 in South Carolina, a woman he picked up on the street in Columbia, and a guy in a restaurant where he worked. Also 2 men at a convenience store in Surrey County, North Carolina. He got life in prison for the 2 murders in North Carolina and the death penalty in South Carolina. Regarding the death penalty in 2022, a federal court said the original judge ignored the fact that Allen had psychiatric problems stemming from a rough childhood. So instead of the death penalty, he got yet another life sentence. 45-year-old. This is another one on our list that isn't exactly a serial killer. This one's about a mass shooting that happened in 2019 where 45-year-old Jerry Martin shot and killed 5 co-workers at the Henry Pratt Company plant in Aurora. Before the shooting, Martin had apparently threatened, "If I get fired, I'm going to kill every motherfucker in here." The next morning, he got fired for a safety violation, not wearing goggles. And true to his words, he executed his colleagues, 5 of them, and wounded 1. His operator had called him in for a meeting to fire him with other colleagues, Parks, Pinkard, Wenner, and Williams being present in the room. Realizing what was happening, Martin went to his workstation to retrieve the weapon, came back, and shouted, "Okay, it's over," before shooting the group. He then walked over to the loading dock and shot an employee known as Juarez. He would then shoot at the police at least 64 times before he was gunned down. 46-year-old. With 6 convicted murders, 27 charges, and 49 murder confessions, in 2007, Robert William Picton was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. He was serving his sentence in Quebec, Canada, until earlier this year when he was attacked and got killed by a fellow prisoner at the Port Cartier institution using a, quote, broken broom-like handle. He'd gotten speared in the head. Now Picton, aka Pig Farmer Killer, is believed to have murdered at least 26 women between 1995 and 2001. Most of them sex workers. His first kill was when he was 46 years old, when he was working in his family's pig farm. He would apparently pick up the women, strangle them, and feed their remains to his pigs. 47-year-old. In a very recent killing spree, Eric Adams, aged 47, fatally shot 5 people and critically injured a 13-year-old before taking his own life a day later. Police from the North Las Vegas Police Department said that they had been notified of a shooting on a Monday evening, and in the apartment in question they found 2 victims, one in her 40s and another in her 50s. Soon enough though, they discovered not only had there been a girl, the 13-year-old, that had been injured and rushed to hospital, but also other victims. They found 2 more bodies, a woman in her mid-20s and a man in his early 20s. A manhunt followed, and the next day, cornered by officers, Adams took his own life. A weird detail also is that he apparently passed by his mom's place to confess what he'd done, bringing along Marshia Harris, his ex, who he had taken hostage after shooting her daughter and her daughter's girlfriend? 48-year-old. At 48 years old, we have Weldon Alexander, who, despite having committed the crime in 1981, remained undiscovered until 42 years later in 2023. The incident took place at the man's home in Texarkana, where 2 siblings, 14-year-old Karen Alexander and 13-year-old Gordon Alexander, were found murdered, fatally stabbed with a butter knife. Karen was found on a bed while Gordon was found in the kitchen. In a horrifying discovery also, it turned out that Karen had been sexually assaulted not only between 48 to 72 hours leading to her death, but also for about 6 months leading to that point. There was no forced entry in the home, and police, unable to find the culprit, shelved the case. That was until 2022 when it was reopened by retired Captain Calvin Seward, who redid the DNA assessment, and quite shockingly, found Weldon's DNA in Karen's bedding. Weldon had assaulted his own daughter and then murdered her and his son Gordon. 49-year-old Harold Shipman, aka Angel of Death or Dr. Death. He was convicted in 2000 and went down as the British doctor who killed his patients for sheer pleasure. Now, the reason I'm putting Shipman under 49-year-old is because although he could have began killing at the age of 29, he was officially convicted of 15 murders that he'd committed between 1995 and 1998, and he was aged 49 in 1995. In total though, it's alleged that he might have killed about 250 people, mostly elderly patients, between 1975 and 1998. He diagnosed them with illnesses they never had and then injected them with a lethal dose of a drug called diamorphine, and he only got caught because he tried to sneak himself into the will of one of his patients, Kathleen Grundy. For his actions, he got life imprisonment, but hung himself in his cell just 4 years into the sentence. 50-year-old. Alright, we're at the halfway mark. I hope you guys are enjoying the video so far. If you guys are, make sure to leave a like, and hopefully I'm on route to earning your subscription. To the people that are watching this that are already subscribed, I appreciate you guys trusting me and giving you good quality videos, informative of course and educational. Now let's continue talking about the 50-year-old. In 2024, Billy Shamirmir, a 50-year-old caretaker who had been charged with 22 murders, made headlines after he was killed by his cellmate using a knife or edged instrument. Now, while his lawyer called it a horrible tragedy, families of his victims felt relieved, even calling it jailhouse justice. That's because prior of his conviction of 2 of the 22 murders, Billy had left behind a trail of dead bodies in Dallas, and what would come to be termed as the pillowcase murders. There's actually a Paramount Plus documentary telling his story. He would apparently target elderly women in their 80s or so, kill them and take off their jewelry and other valuables. He got caught though after one victim, a 91-year-old, explained to police what had happened, talking about the forced entry and smothering bit, which prompted them to look into the deaths of older people in the Dallas area around the time. 51-year-old. On February 26, 2020, at about 2 p.m., Milwaukee police were alerted of a shooting incident at the Molson Coors Beverage Company. The incident, which went ahead to attract a large number of first responders, ended up being rather tragic as it was discovered that the perpetrator, 51-year-old Anthony Farrell, had shot and killed 5 Molson Coors employees. These were Dale Hudson, age 60, Trevor Wetzelar, age 33, Jesus Valle Jr., age 33, Dana Walk, 57, and Gennady Lefschitz, 61. Farrell had apparently left the Miller's Course campus only to return with 2 guns. It was never established why exactly he did it though, and issues of racism, paranoia, and erratic behavior were brought up in the investigation. On the day of the incident, Farrell also took his own life before the police got to him. 52-year-old. There's a chance that hitting someone while driving could be considered an accident, but then running over a person multiple times is honestly a whole nother level. And that's exactly what 52-year-old Pedro Alberto Hernandez was arrested and charged with in 2022. A media release from the Houston Police Department shockingly indicated that while driving under the influence, Hernandez had fatally run over a 6-year-old Darian Lewis multiple times, leading to his death. He had been driving through a parking lot when the incident happened. Darian's grandpa said that Hernandez also showed disregard for the kid because he had a smirk on his face days as he stopped, backed up, drove over his grandson again, and stopped a truck on his head. It also came out that Hernandez had about 4 other DUI arrests. What's crazy though is that he never got convicted because of a lack of sufficient evidence, including a claim that he'd not been drunk at the time of the incident and just simply never saw the kid in the first place. 53-year-old. In 2013, at the age of 53, Richard Ramirez, a rather prolific serial killer, died of health complications in prison while awaiting his death sentence. Now, his story was pretty insane because despite having done really heinous things, he had fans who were even writing him letters and paid him visits as the trial went on. Pretty odd for someone who was a sex offender and serial killer of at least 14 victims. Ramirez had operated largely in the LA and San Francisco Bay Area from 1984 to 1985, with his MO being breaking into homes in the afternoon and would either punch, pistol whip, or strangle his victims. That's to say he had a variety of methods, including a time when he stomped one of his victims as they slept and also tortured another with live electrical wires. Again, he died while awaiting his death sentence. 54-year-old. Although arrested in 1979, Paul Stephen Hay sort of remains in the internet archives as the 54-year-old serial killer because that's the age he was when his case was being heard at the Victoria Supreme Court in Australia. He had been trying to get a minimum jail term for his crimes, claiming he was a victim of borderline personality disorder. His lawyer argued that the condition is what had led to Hay killing 6 people, including a 10-year-old boy in the late 70s. The appeal was rejected though, and he ended up with 7 counts of murder, which earned him life without parole. One particular murder I found rather horrific, though to be honest they all were, was his girlfriend's, Lisa Brearley. He had apparently stabbed her a total of 157 times after allowing another man to rape and sodomize her at knife point. He told the court he only intended to stab her 20 times but lost count. 55-year-old. This next one is an ongoing case, but still worth a look at. I'm referring to the very recent arrest and charging of 55-year-old Chad Irish for the murder of 31-year-old Yasmin Williams. This is alleged to have happened in Kips Bay, Manhattan, after the two had an argument as Williams was out disposing of her trash. Irish had apparently been heard threatening Williams, saying, "I'll shoot you," and so it was very suspicious that that was the last time she was seen alive. She never went back up to the apartment via the elevator and never left the building. She would later be found in a sleeping bag, dead, and thrown onto the sidewalk. Though Irish denied involvement, he was accused of weapon possession, and it also turned out this wouldn't be the first murder he had been charged with. In 1994, he's alleged to have blown up a house as his uncle walked in. 56-year-old. In June 2023, 56-year-old Kathleen Folbig, an Australian woman who had for years been considered Australia's worst female serial killer, was pardoned and released from prison. So this is a case of wrongful conviction, but an interesting one nevertheless. So yes, the 56-year-old on our list is extremely different than the other cases. Folbig had been sentenced to 40 years in prison over the successive deaths of her 4 children between 1989 and 1999. She was charged with smothering them, but it wasn't until a book, Murder, Medicine, and Motherhood, by a professor, Emma Cunliffe, came out and had people questioning the evidence. A closer look led to rather shocking discoveries. The kids had died from genuine health complications like rare gene variants and heart inflammation, and not smothering as it was initially thought. So, Folbig was not the serial killer most had painted her out to be. Her lawyers said she demands substantial compensation from the state government for the time she spent in prison. 57-year-old. In 2020, the case of 57-year-old Lee Chun-jae hit the headlines, and for the most part, it was as if he was throwing shade at the South Korean police investigators for failing to catch him sooner. Lee had already been in jail serving a life sentence for the rape and murder of his sister-in-law, but had been brought back to court after DNA connected him to a series of deaths that had taken place between 1986 and 91. A man named Yoon had instead been convicted for one of the 10 murders and spent 20 years in prison. Now, Lee's admission was shocking because he wondered how, despite not trying to hide evidence or anything, investigators talked and probed everyone else but him. He said he was even wearing a watch belonging to one of the victims as police questioned him about the victim. Anyway, because the murders happened in the 90s, the statute of limitations on them had run out and he couldn't be charged for them. 58-year-old. In yet another case of convicted serial killers making headlines, last year, 58-year-old Paul Bernardo was in the news after Canada's prison service decided to move him from a maximum security prison to a medium security one. This was met with some uproar because Bernardo had a pretty grim past, having been charged with a series of rapes and murders spanning the 80s and 90s. Specifically, he'd been sentenced to prison in 1995 to life for kidnapping, torturing, and killing school-aged girls, Leslie Mahaffey, age 14, and Kristen French, age 15. He'd also been found guilty of raping and killing his 15-year-old sister-in-law, Tammy Homolka. It was also weird that his wife, Carla Homolka, had apparently helped him in the killings, where the total number of suspected victims between 1987 to 1992 was at least 18. 59-year-old. There's an ongoing case in New York of this 59-year-old man by the name of Rex Heuermann, who it is alleged that despite living in a rather quiet suburb in Nassau County and being a quote well-dressed man who would commute to work in Manhattan as an architect, end quote, is the serial killer behind a string of disappearances of women on Long Island, New York. DNA and cell phone tracking had apparently led detectives to him, with the investigators admitting that they had been looking for him for years, given bodies had been found on Gilgo Beach from as early as 2010. However, while a total of 16 victims were discovered, he had only been linked to 4 who share the same MO in their slayings. They were found in similar positions, bound with either belts or tape and wrapped in burlap type material. 60-year-old. There's a rather sad and strange case that happened in Florida earlier this year, where a 45-year-old middle school teacher from the Manatee Academy K-8 school, Jamie Felix, was kidnapped and killed by her 60-year-old husband, Ray Felix. Ray had apparently snuck up on Jamie at a parking lot in Port St. Lucie around 4 p.m., forced her and the younger kid into her SUV, and had his older son follow them in his rental car. Before departing though, he wrote a suspicious email to her coworkers, pretending to be her, taking back the comments about a domestic violence incident she'd raised earlier on. Later on, at 7 p.m., they made a stop. He got out and then fired multiple shots at Jamie, killing her instantly. He would then flee in the rental car, return it, and about a quarter mile away from Jamie's body, he would take his life by suicide. The two were said to have been undergoing a messy divorce. 61-year-old. About 2 months ago, on June 1st, a homeowner in the 6000 block of Buckingham Court, Northwest Georgia, called 911 to report that their neighbor's garage was on fire. Naturally, the fire department rushed over, and just as they were putting out the fire, another fire was reported just a little over 3 miles away. This one in the 1300 block of Turner's Ridge Drive. There were several victims with a family of 4 being displaced in the first one, and 4 adults with 2 minors being displaced in the second one. Unfortunately, one person didn't make it. And the investigation revealed that both fires could have been the work of 61-year-old Hong Huyen, who is believed to have started both fires on purpose. She is being charged with first-degree arson and aggravated assault, among 3 other crimes. 62-year-old. Again, also about 2 months ago in June, there was a pretty bizarre case of a 62-year-old woman by the name of Jacqueline Reed, who not only stabbed and killed a pregnant teenager, but apparently also sat with the girl's family, watching them grieve. It remains unknown why exactly Reed did what she did, but the facts as presented in court were that she had used a sharp object to repeatedly stab 17-year-old Malaysia Hogg. Malaysia had been just days from giving birth, which meant that Reed got charged with 2 counts of murder. What angered the family, though, besides the crime itself, is that Reed not only lied when asked about Malaysia's whereabouts by her stepfather, but also hung around her family as they grieved. 63-year-old. One Sunday morning in January of this year, a 63-year-old man, Maher Qasim, called 911 to report that his wife, Majeda Qasim, had been shot at the 7400 block of West 173rd Place. It would soon be discovered that Qasim had not only been the shooter, but also that he killed 3 of his daughters. According to his 19-year-old son, who survived the incident, his dad had been arguing with the mom and daughters, and they had taken the fight to the basement. After a while, the son had apparently heard a gunshot, and the arguing turned into screams. As he went to look, he found that his dad shot the mom and 2 sisters. He then watched him shoot his other sister and then go back and shoot his mom twice again. As to what they were arguing about, some clue could be in what was captured in the police body-worn camera, where Majeda ranted saying things like, "I worked all my life to give my family a better home and they treat me like shit." 64-year-old. One of the pretty twisted killings of the 80s was by Dorothy Puente, a woman who got nicknamed Death House Landlady because of her MO. Puente, who stood for trial at the age of 64, was found guilty of 3 of 9 murders that she had been accused of, all having occurred at her boarding house in Sacramento, California. It came to light that between 1982 and 1988, she would use an assortment of drugs, like codeine and others, to incapacitate and kill different people, including those that were mentally disabled and elderly. She would then cash their social security checks. It wasn't until 1988 when Alvaro Bert Gonzalez Montoya, age 51, disappeared while at the facility that investigations began. A roommate of Montoya alerted the police, who within hours found his body stashed within the property. Puente ended up getting life imprisonment and died in prison in 2011, aged 82. 65-year-old. This next one is simply an unfortunate situation that got out of control. So in April this year, at the Fair Park apartment complex in South Boulevard, Dallas, two women, 17-year-old Jernesia Willis and an unnamed woman, began fighting for whatever reason. A neighbor, 65-year-old Doris Walker, intervened and took the unnamed woman into her apartment. Undeterred, Willis called for backup, her mom, 40-year-old Lenishia Pinkard, and they both allegedly forced their way into Walker's apartment. While inside, they beat up this unknown woman and apparently threatened to rough up Walker too. In return, Walker shot both of them. First, she shot Willis as she tried to leave, and then her mom, Pinkard, while she was still inside. Her excuse was that she thought Pinkard had a gun on her. The police couldn't prove that though, so she got charged with 2 counts of capital murder. 66-year-old. Last year, in the rather quiet neighborhood of North Ogden, Utah, 66-year-old Jeffrey Roberts shocked many after killing his brother, Scott Roberts, and attempting to kill Roberts' wife too. Jeffrey had apparently driven there all the way from Long Beach, California, and according to footage from a Ring camera, he wanted to know the whereabouts of a particular family member. Shortly after, he pulled out a gun and shot his brother at point-blank range, and then went on to shoot the wife. The brother died immediately, but the wife survived and was later taken to the hospital. Meanwhile, a neighbor called the police, and as soon as they arrived, Jeffrey started shooting at them, leading to him being shot and killed in the process. It also seems like he tried to cover his tracks because by the time the police arrived, he had set fire to the house using road flares. 67-year-old. 40 miles south of Tuzla in Okmulgee, a small town of 11,000 people, 4 men, Mark Chastain, Billy Chastain, Mike Sparks, and Alex Stevens, were found dumped in the Deep Fork River. This was in October 2022, and while initially there were no leads, a woman would later come forward and reveal that 67-year-old Joseph Lloyd Kennedy II had confessed to her of having killed and cut up these 4 guys in a scrapyard. He claimed that they were stealing from him. Now, I'm not sure how the case proceeded because in 2023, it had turned into a civil suit, and he was being asked to pay damages to the families of these 4 men. The requested figure was about $75,000 for each person. Also, rather interestingly, the day Kennedy got taken into custody, his wife, Sandra, went and filed for divorce. That's despite the lawsuit for damages having been filed against both of them. 68-year-old. In 2015, a Russian woman, 68-year-old Tamara Samsonova, was apprehended and was sent to a specialized institution after it was discovered that she had killed 2 people in Norilsk, Russia, and she did this with extreme cruelty. First, she had killed a tenant named Sergei Potanin in an unclear quarrel. It is claimed that after her husband disappeared, she had begun renting out a room in her apartment, and that is how Potanin had ended up there in the first place. Anyway, after the argument, she killed him, chopped him up, and disposed of his body on the streets. That was in 2003. And in 2015, she would kill yet another person in almost a similar way. This time, the victim was 79-year-old Valentina Ulanova, who she poisoned with phenazepam, a prescription drug, before cutting her up with 2 knives and a saw. She recklessly disposed of parts of the body, taking some to the streets and leaving some in the house. Soon enough, the police traced it all to her, and she was arrested. 69-year-old. In 1939, a man by the name of Ray Copeland had just gotten out of jail where he'd been for a year for stealing livestock. Soon after, he met Faye Wilson and they hit it off, so much so that they got married and started a family. Their story would however take a drastic turn because by the time Faye was 69 and Ray 76, they became the oldest couple to ever be sentenced to death in the US. They had gotten convicted of killing at least 5 drifters in their Mooresville, Missouri farm, and they really were brutal at it because they would, for example, shoot them with a .22 caliber Marlin rifle and then use the dead victim's clothing to sew quilts that they would snuggle under in the winter. Anyway, for what they did, they both got a death sentence and Ray died in prison aged 78 while Faye died in 2003 aged 82. 70-year-old. In a very strange incident in Philadelphia, a 70-year-old woman, Renee DiPietro, stabbed and killed 31-year-old Michael Sides with a blade concealed in her walking cane. The story is that Sides had been in a physical altercation with Renee's son earlier that day at a bar, the Admore Bar. Then, unable to let it go, he later followed Renee's son to a car to confront him about it. In the car were Renee's parents, and as her son tried to get in, Sides got physical with him, something which prompted Renee to take out her sword and stab him with its 16-inch blade. Surveillance video apparently showed Sides falling over from the first strike before Renee went on to stab him again as he lay on the ground. For the murder, Renee was sentenced to 20 to 40 years in prison. 71-year-old. What do you do when your roommate refuses to clean up after themselves? Well, a 71-year-old woman in Tampa, Florida decided it would be best to just shoot and kill them. According to the Tampa Police Department, they had received reports of a shooting, and when they arrived at the home on East 26th Avenue, they found a man shot multiple times in the upper body. The perpetrator, 71-year-old Patricia Whitehead, said that the victim had walked out and she heard him slam the door as he left. She took the gun from the bedroom, followed him outside, and shot him several times. She was charged with first-degree murder. It also came out that she had warned other people in the house, including his wife, and also the landlord, that if he were ever be found dead, then it would definitely be by the fault of her. 72-year-old. This next person wasn't 72 when they were doing the killings, but they were 72 years old when they made headlines. I'm talking about the case of Dennis Nilsen, who back in 1983 admitted to having killed at least 15 people in the 70s and 80s. He would target young gay men who he would lure to his Muswell Hill, North London home before murdering and cutting up their bodies. He came to be arrested age 37 after his drain pipes got blocked, and whoever went to check them out found human remains there. Interestingly, he was one of the tenants who complained to the landlord about a foul smell coming from the drains. 3 bodies were found in his house and 8 more in his previous address in Cricklewood, northwest London. 73-year-old. Aged 73, a serial killer by the name of Rodney Alcala, while in prison, made headlines because he faced new charges for murder in rural Wyoming in 1978, but was too ill to be extradited to Wyoming to stand trial. The reason he ended up in California's Corcoran State Prison is because he was responsible for a string of murders committed between 1977 and 1979. The victims were suspected to be as many as 130, although his initial charge was for 5 murders. Now, murdering itself is pretty horrific, but then his case was made worse by the fact that he would taunt his victims, sort of toying with them before finishing them off. He would, for instance, strangle them until they were unconscious, wait for them to wake up, then do it again and again until they just couldn't take it anymore. Oh, and for some reason, he had a collection of 1,000 explicit photos of women and teen boys and girls. Some of them ended up being his victims. 74-year-old. One of the most infamous killers in recent Japan's history is Chisako Kalahi, a 74-year-old who even got nicknamed the Black Widow Killer due to her ruthlessness. Kalahi, whose husband passed on in 1994, began her murders in 2007, with her goal being to find single unsuspecting men and just simply poison them. She used a Japanese matchmaking agency as her hunting ground, and that's where she actually met her first victim, 78-year-old Toshiaki Suhiro. She poisoned him with a cyanide pill, and although he didn't die immediately, he passed on within a year. She would then go on to poison a motorcycle rider, Masanori Honda, age 71, and then a cancer survivor, Minori Hiyoki, 75. And why was she doing it? Well, one thing all the victims had in common was their considerable assets and savings. Yeah, she was just in it for the money. 75-year-old. This year, a 75-year-old serial killer by the name of Edmund Kemper surprised some people after he failed to show up for his own parole hearing at a California court. Also known as the co-ed killer, co-ed butcher, or ogre of Aptos, this guy was responsible for the murders of his mother, her friend, and 6 female students aged between 15 and 23. These murders happened in Santa Cruz between 1972 and 73. He had turned himself into the police, but not before decapitating the victims and chopping them up. Also, it turned out that earlier on, aged just 15, he had killed his grandparents, first shooting his grandma during a heated argument, and then his grandpa after he got home later that evening. He had served time at a mental hospital for those 2 killings. Anyway, the reason he gave for not showing up at the parole hearing is that he was just fine staying in prison. 76-year-old. Though not this year, there is a 76-year-old who, while serving a jail term for multiple murders, admitted to yet more crimes that happened about 50 years ago. I'm talking about the case of Richard Cottingham, who is still serving a life sentence in New Jersey for about a half dozen murders of women and girls, both in New Jersey and New York in the 1960s. He's been admitting to new murders over time, up to 100 in the last 10 years, with the most recent case being that of Diane Cusick. Cusick was strangled and killed more than 50 years ago, and her killer had never been found. If found guilty to that additional murder, he would get 25 years on top of the life sentence that he's serving. Also, he was given some nicknames from the media. That would be Torso Killer and Times Square Ripper. Well, he was known to mutilate his victims quite a lot. 77-year-old. Next up is the pretty interesting story of a guy who a judge was lenient with, letting him out to the streets early because he thought the guy was too old to kill, but then he ended up killing again. The man, 77-year-old Albert Flick, first killed his wife Sandra in 1979, stabbing her to death in front of her daughter. He got sentenced to 25 years in prison and served his time in full and was out in 2004. He then got convicted for an assault on 2 women in 2010, and that's when the judge gave him 4 years instead of 8 or 9 as the prosecutors wanted. He believed Flick was too old to commit a crime again. He got out in 2014 and moved to a town called Lewiston, where he stalked Kimberly Dobby, age 48, for quite some time before killing her in 2018 by stabbing her 14 times, including the heart and lungs. He had been infatuated with her. 78-year-old. In 2022, a 78-year-old serial killer, Charles Sabraj, aka the Serpent, made headlines after he was released from a Nepali jail, Kathmandu Central Jail, and set on his way back to France, where he was a citizen. Why the release? Well, Charles had served the minimum required years of his 20-year sentence for the murder of an American tourist in 1975 in Nepal, and also for killing his Canadian friend. Now, while convicted for just those two murders, it was suspected that Charles had been responsible for as many as 20 other killings of Western backpackers in the hippie trail in Asia in the 70s and 80s. He actually admitted to some of the murders, but still the true number of victims remains unclear. Anyway, overall, it seems the government in Nepal just shipped him off to France because they didn't want him to die there. He was said to have a heart issue, hence in poor health, though he had also shown good behavior while incarcerated. 79-year-old. So far, we've seen people killed for all sorts of reasons, but nothing compares to this next one. Apparently, 79-year-old Joseph Nazo had targeted and strangled prostitutes whose names had matching initials: Roxine Ragash, Carmen Colon, Pamela Parsons, and Tracy Tafoya. These crimes dated as far back as the 1950s, and although he told the court he was no monster and never intended to kill the women, the judge referred to him as an evil and disturbed man. At the time of the murders, Nazo was a photographer, and part of the evidence against him had actually been a collection of photos of partially nude women that appeared dead or knocked out. In his home was also a journal detailing the rapes of many women and underage girls. And as if that wasn't incriminating enough, he had a list of 10 which described and referenced killings he did in the rural areas where the bodies had been dumped. 80-year-old. There's quite a sad incident that happened recently in southwest London where an 80-year-old Alan Sharp was arrested and charged with the murder of his 80-year-old wife, Jenny Sharp. Police had apparently called to the home in Rayburn Avenue by someone who found Jenny unresponsive, and shortly after, she was pronounced dead. A post-mortem examination showed that Jenny died of manual compression of the neck, meaning she must have been suffocated with something like a pillow. Anyway, there's a separate incident that happened right here in the US in 2023 that I also found strange. It's a story of an 80-year-old man who shot and killed another 30-year-old man who had followed an older lady home after what was suspected to have been a road rage incident. The two, the lady and the younger man, had pulled over at an Amazon Fresh parking lot, which was near where the lady lived, and as the guy confronted the lady, the 80-year-old came out of his house in a robe, and after some disrespectful exchange of words, he shot and killed them on the spot. 81-year-old. This next one happened in Ohio, where 81-year-old William Brock shot and killed an Uber driver, Lolitha Hall, 61, having mistaken her for a scammer. The whole thing started when someone called Brock, pretending to be an official of the local court, and asked him to pay a large amount as bond for a family member that was in custody. I'm not sure how the conversation went, but the scammer, ready to take the money, had ordered an Uber ride with the pickup destination as Brock's home. The Uber driver, Hall, was of course not aware they were being used to ferry cash. Anyway, when Hall arrived, Brock confronted her with a gun, asking her who she worked for. They argued a bit, and despite Hall posing no threat and having no weapon, Brock shot her, then again after exchanging a few more words, shot her another time. After these 3 shots, Brock then called the police. Hall was taken to a hospital, but unfortunately succumbed to the injuries. I've actually heard of these cases. I don't know if we've talked about it on the channel. I've talked about a lot of things on this channel. I think there's this option on Uber where you can get people to deliver stuff for you, and some people make a fake scam call to an old person and tell them to put like $2,000 in a box, for example, and then they unknowingly get an Uber driver to pick up said box, and sometimes the old people just don't take it and they're like, why are you scamming me? And the Uber driver is like, bro, I'm just doing what someone on the app told me to pick up this box. And obviously bad things happen. Nothing more to say other than people just use that option for horrible reasons. Let's head on to the next one. 82-year-old. I don't know if there's a pattern here, but this next one is also about a released killer proving the parole board wrong and reoffending. The case involves 82-year-old Ron Evans, who had spent more than 50 years in prison for a murder he did in the 60s. He had been charged with the rape and murder of 21-year-old Kathleen Heathcote in 1964, but also beyond that, had been associated with several attacks on women in Bristol, UK, and even been branded the Clifton. For the murder, he served 11 years and got out, but then went back in for the assault charges, with the judge saying he won't ever be released again. In 2014 though, the parole board let him out, and once out, without telling his probation officer, he began volunteering at a center where vulnerable women attended. Unfortunately, while there, over a period of 3 years, he sexually assaulted 2 vulnerable women, both with disabilities. He later got convicted on one of those charges in 2018. 83-year-old. Still sort of proving the point about a pattern, this next case is about 83-year-old Harvey Marcelin, who was released and went on to offend not once, but twice over. The first time, he had been in jail serving life for the murder of Jacqueline Bonds, which he committed in 1963, but got let go in 1984 on lifetime parole. A year later, he stabbed and killed his girlfriend and threw her body out in the street in a trash bag. He got 6 to 12 years for that case. He became eligible for parole in the 90s, but because he admitted to having problems with women, he wasn't released. That was until 2019 though, when he was let out and probably unsurprisingly went on to murder again. The victim this time being his friend, 68-year-old Susan Layden. He apparently disposed of her torso, no head, arms, or legs, on a Brooklyn street and had been seen in a video sitting on top of a human leg, riding around in a motorized scooter. 84-year-old. In November of 2023, police from the Montgomery Police Department received a 911 call from the Lower Pottsgrove Township about a woman who had been beaten to death and a kitchen ransacked. When they arrived, they found 84-year-old Barnes Seltman at the rear porch of the house and his wife Margaret Seltman, age 85, lying dead on the kitchen floor. They soon realized that the call had been made by Barton himself, and what he hadn't mentioned was that he was the one responsible for his wife's death. In a later admission, he would explain that they had argued over their cat's vet bill before Margaret allegedly threatened him with a knife, and he responded by beating her with a candle holder. He hit her several times in the head and recalled her saying, "You are killing me," before she, quote, went to sleep. That's when she died. He never got tried though, because after that, his health deteriorated rapidly, including worsened dementia. He was transferred from county jail to a private medical facility. 85-year-old. This next one is just as sad as the last one. It involves an 85-year-old man, Stephen Schwartz, who stabbed and killed his wife, 81-year-old Sharon Hilda, in a moment of fury over pancakes. This happened at their home in the 1300 block of Corcoran Street, Northwest DC, and according to police reports, Schwartz admitted he got furious after Hilda tried to force pancakes on him. He reached for a carving knife from a butcher's block in their kitchen and stabbed her in the back before stabbing himself too. Now, the sad thing is, Hilda was only trying to get his weight up after he spent so much time at the hospital. He didn't get charged though, because the judge found him to be in too poor of a health condition to stand trial. He was bedridden at the time and was simply put under monitoring with a GPS device attached to him. 86-year-old. Last year, Ovidio Porras, an 86-year-old man, ended up in custody for the murder of his wife, 78-year-old Luz Porras, at their home in Woodhaven, New York. The couple's son had apparently called 911 when he found his mom lying at the foot of the stairs. Investigators would then reveal that Porras had pushed her down the stairs after a heated argument between the two. When police had arrived, he had been found with blood on his face and bare feet. It also came up that that was not the first time the police were responding to a fight between the two, and also that Luz had filed for divorce just 2 months earlier. The prosecution of Porras, however, proved difficult because while in jail in Rikers Island, he got into a, quote, use of force, end quote, situation with correctional officers and ended up with a blood clot that had him in hospital indefinitely. 87-year-old. So I'm sure you're starting to see a pattern for these older folk, and it seems like it's a lot of, I guess, domestic murders, husbands killing their wives. It's pretty sad stuff. And yet another case of an elderly husband killing his wife in 2022, a Kansas resident, Frank Mayfield, while aged 87, shot and killed his wife, Donna Mayfield, also aged 87, before taking his own life by suicide. Frank had called 911 to report that his wife had been shot, and by the time the police arrived, he had shot himself too. He of course hadn't disclosed he was the one who shot her, but it was pretty obvious. Now, as to why he did it, a son-in-law apparently suggested that he, Frank, was tired of taking care of Donna and didn't want to do it anymore. At the time of her death, Donna was confined to a hospital bed. The incident shocked many, particularly the neighbors, because the two, up until that day, had been a loving couple, free of any problems. 88-year-old. In 2009, 88-year-old James Winokur Von Brunn made headlines after he went into the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. with a rifle and opened fire, killing Stephen Tyron Jones, a museum special police officer who had opened the door for him. Other present officers, Harry Weeks and Jason McHuston, had quickly responded and wounded Brunn, who would then be rushed to the hospital and survive. As for the motive, it was thought that the then President Barack Obama's visit to the Buchenwald concentration camp in Germany could have been what set him off. He was known to have been a neo-Nazi, a white supremacist, and a Holocaust denier. The incident happened in 2009, and just a year later, while waiting for trial, Brunn died at a federal prison in North Carolina. 89-year-old. There was a pretty sad incident that happened in Penn Yan, New York last year in August, where a man, 89-year-old Ronald Sawyer, suffering from dementia, is suspected to have killed his wife, Jane Sawyer, also aged 89, at their home. A home health aide had called the police reporting that she found Jane unresponsive, lying on the bathroom floor. She also found Ronald on the same floor. He was alive, but, quote, in poor health. Based on their investigation, the police believed that Ronald had strangled Jane with a bath towel. This wasn't certain though. Then, just a month after his arrest, Ronald died while undergoing palliative care at a hospital. His health had deteriorated a lot. Police kept on investigating Jane's death though. 90-year-old. In 2018, evidence from a Fitbit and surveillance camera led to the arrest and charging of 90-year-old Anthony Ilo in connection to the death of his stepdaughter, 67-year-old Karen Navarra. According to the police, Anthony had slashed and stabbed Navarra at her home with a kitchen knife. He then abandoned her body and then moved on like nothing happened. Days later, relatives had called in for a welfare check on her, and that's when she was found. Now, although Anthony denied being responsible, surveillance footage placed him at the crime scene at the time of her death, which was determined by a sudden spike in her heart rate before it completely stopped. This incident happened in 2018, and barely a year later, Anthony died in prison while awaiting trial. He had apparently been shuttling back and forth between the main jail infirmary and the Valley Medical Center hospital due to medical complications. 91-year-old. Towards the end of last year, 85-year-old Mariah Damasi, a volunteer at a community-based meal service in Adelaide, South Australia, was pronounced dead, much to the dismay of many. She had apparently been a passionate contributor to the kitchen's operation, which distributed meals to the vulnerable, especially the elderly. Now, the circumstances of her death were unclear, but the South Australia police arrested and charged her 91-year-old husband, Frank Damasi. The case has been ongoing, but in a recent hearing, Frank's lawyer expressed concerns that he's been suffering from dementia and isn't even aware of what's happening. He's been receiving treatment at a nearby medical facility under the watch of a prison officer. Regardless, the judge held that Frank would still stand trial. 92-year-old. This next case had the perpetrator, 92-year-old Donald Morley, go on record as the oldest person who has ever been prosecuted for murder at the Australian Capital Territory, that being Magistrates Court. Morley was sentenced to 9 years with no possible parole until after 4.5 years. Investigations revealed that in July of 2023, he had suffocated and killed his wife, Jean Morley, also aged 92 at the time. This happened at their home in Canberra, ACT. Now, rather strangely, Donald's attorney, John White, told the court that the murder was sort of a mercy killing because Jean apparently had a worsening case of dementia and Donald himself had the issue of declining health. The court, however, insisted that murder remains murder regardless of age and that Donald's actions had robbed Jean of individual autonomy. 93-year-old. In Montgomery County, there's a murder that happened in 2023 that is really similar to a few that we've covered. The case involved 93-year-old Stanley Brown, who shot his wife, 94-year-old Florence Brown, at their home in Lawndale before turning the gun on himself. Stanley had been the one that called 911, and after stating he'd shot her, he told the dispatcher he was going to kill himself, and then a few shots were heard after that. The police found him slouched on a chair with several bullets in his chest, and surprisingly, both of them were still alive. They would, however, pass on later in the hospital while receiving care. Florence died first, and then Stanley followed, shortly after he had undergone emergency surgery. It also came out that Florence had been suffering a case of dementia, and Stanley had been her caretaker. 94-year-old. Probably one of the oldest people to be shipped to jail in Florida is 94-year-old Wayne Julin. In 2019, he was charged with first-degree premeditated murder after he shot and killed his wife, Mrs. Julin, who was aged 80 at the time. Reason? Well, by Julin's own admission, the wife was suffering from a bad case of dementia. It was supposed to be a, quote, mercy killing. Also, he told detectives that he had intended to take his own life too, but the gun had malfunctioned on him. Unable to he called 911 and reported himself for the incident. He got picked up by officers from the Venice Police Department and taken to the Sarasota County Jail. 95-year-old. In 2021, a German court charged 95-year-old Irmgard Ferkner with murder and attempted murder following the prosecution, alleging that she was complicit in the murder of 10,000 people at the Stutthof concentration camp during World War II. She had worked as a secretary and stenographer, and the camp and the prosecution argued that she helped those in charge of the camp carry out the systematic killing of Jewish prisoners, amongst other prisoners. Interestingly, because she had been under 21 at the time, her case was being heard by the juvenile court. Yeah, pretty confusing for a 95-year-old to be in a juvenile court, but apparently that's how things work in Germany. Now, to be more specific, she was charged with 11,412 counts of being an accessory to murder and 18 counts of being an accessory to attempted murder. She was found guilty of these terms in 2022 and sentenced to a suspended jail term of 2 years. She is currently aged 99. 96-year-old. This one is technically not a murder, but it's still interesting nonetheless. It's the case of 96-year-old Seymour Taffler, who was caught by the police trying to murder his wife, 90-year-old Elaine Taffler. Police had been called to the home, located in Berea, Kentucky, over what the caller described as a domestic violence incident, and when they got to the scene, they found Taffler standing over his wife in an attempt to smother her. Why? Well, she had dementia. Their daughter told the police that Taffler had just snapped and gone after her. He also confessed that he did indeed try to smother Elaine because the two didn't have long to live anyway. He claimed that Elaine had told him on several occasions that she wanted to die. His plan that day was to kill her and then kill himself. 97-year-old. Next up is the very short incident of a Japanese man who crashed into pedestrians and killed one person in the process. As reported by Japanese media, a 97-year-old man who had been driving a mini vehicle in Fukushima suddenly drove into the sidewalk where he hit a woman in her 40s and injured at least 5 other people. This had been on a straight road with one lane headed in each direction. The man also crashed into 3 cars that had been waiting at nearby traffic lights. Now, that woman in her 40s who got hit had apparently not died immediately, but unfortunately passed on later in the hospital. It's unclear what happened to the man. 98-year-old. In 2009, the Massachusetts grand jury had to decide on a pretty rare case where a 98-year-old woman, Laura Lundquist, strangled and killed her roommate, 100-year-old Elizabeth Barrow. The two were residents at the Brandon Woods nursing home in Dartmouth, and the whole thing had started after they argued over a table that Laura had placed at the edge of Barrow's bed. Barrow had apparently resisted the idea of the table because it obstructed her path to the bedroom. It was believed that Laura, angry at the decision to not have the table there, had taken a plastic shopping bag and used it to strangle Barrow. Before that, the two were said to have related like sisters and would have lunch together each day and could even be heard saying "goodnight, I love you" to each other every night. 99-year-old. We don't have a murderer for the age of 99, so instead here's a story of one of the happiest prisoners ever. I know, a happy part in this video, that's insane. Her name is Annie, last name was never published, and aged 99, she requested to be arrested by the Dutch police just to tick it off her bucket list. This happened in 2017, so I sadly don't know if she has passed on by now, but chances are she has. I mean, she was 99 and it's been 7 years, so I hope she's still alive, but chances are she's not. Anyway, let's continue with the story. It had apparently been a lifelong dream of hers, and so the police were very much obliged, making a one-time exception just for her. They picked her up and escorted her to a prison in this place, which I'm not even gonna bother pronouncing, somewhere southeast of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. On her way there, she was in handcuffs and somehow grinning with delight. She spent time in a cell for a couple minutes before being let go. 100-year-old. In a rather unfortunate incident in New Jersey in 2015, a man by the name of Michael Juskin, aged 100, killed his 88-year-old wife, Rosalia, before also taking his own life. The details were pretty gruesome because Juskin had apparently used an axe to strike Rosalia as she slept and then killed himself by his wrists. This happened on a Sunday night, and it wasn't until the next day that a family member found the bodies and called 911. The motive of the murder wasn't clear, but it was said that the two had a history of domestic issues. It was also said that they would spend time together a lot, and Rosalia would, quote, be in her garden all the time, end quote. Alright guys, we made it to the end of ages 1 to 100 serial killers. Wow, that took a long time to record. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to leave a like. If I earned your subscription, make sure to subscribe. If this video format does good, of course, we'll try out other formats. And if there's a specific story in there that you want me to cover, let me know. But yeah, that's really it for this video. Make sure to follow me on Instagram at @mynameistov. Join my Discord. Maybe consider joining the Patreon. It's only $5. You get every video 24 hours before they actually come out on YouTube. And you get to talk to me also on that Discord. And go stream my new mixtape, Dreamcatcher. It's out on all DSPs. You can listen to it anywhere. And buy Earl. Check out the Earl store. That's my brand. It's down in the description. I haven't promoted myself in a long time, but I feel like I deserve it after putting this much work into this video. That's it for this one. I'll see you guys next time I upload.